Yes, so thank you very much for the invitation again, and I know it's quite difficult times, and thank you for coming and showing up, although we also all have probably something different on our minds in these times. So here is the book I'm going to talk about today, quite thick. And yes, this was my habilitation, and this is a double biography of Jan Czochralski and Ludwik Hirszfeld. And at the beginning, I would like to start with some remarks on why I chose this methodology to write this double biography. It's not only because the Polish Post decided to put those two scientists to issue these special edition stamps with both scientists on them in 2009, because then I already had started my project. Okay, so I will talk a bit about the biography and then have a look at the transnational lives themselves, and then what I concluded from that. Okay, so when it comes to biography and why I used biography in this work to approach the historical topic of transnational science, then on the one hand, biographies very often oscillate between an identity relevant creating of significance and historical knowledge. And this is also why the telling of life stories has often been placed in the service of nations. So biographical approaches up to the present day have therefore very often concentrated predominantly on national or disciplinary contexts. It has also changed considerably over the last years, and today biography is often used to overcome narrowly set spatial, political, social, or cultural historical caesurae, which makes it possible to capture the complexity of historical situations and to describe the dynamics of change and continuity, as well as integrating a variety of fields and aspects of history, such as gender history or the history of materiality, and many more. So I wanted to use this biographical approach to develop plural and decentralized perspectives on the lives of Jan Czochralski and Ludwik Hirszfeld and their spaces of knowledge that somehow move away a bit from the perspectives of a nation and great male inventors. So the assumption that science is determined by the actions of great men and is to be understood as their success story has been replaced today by a much more integrated perspective in which science is tied back to its context. Scientific knowledge develops in interdependence with society, with institutions, with networks, and with discourses within and outside science. And the epistemological reflections of Ludwig Fleck have contributed significantly to the conviction that science does not take place in the minds of a few ingenious minds and is not a linear accumulation of discoveries and insights on the way to a generally accepted truth. So today, and this is also how I looked at this scientific biography, combines the analysis of the individual's lives with such approaches to the history of science that understand science, and that means also, of course, the natural or life sciences as a social process. So now still the question remains, why a double biography? First of all, the two men really structurally and conceptually had many things in common beyond the fact that they shared one or similar generational experience. Both came from the Polish territories annexed by Prussia, Austria, and Russia. Czochralski was born in the small town in Gdynia in Prussia in a Polish Catholic milieu, and Hirszfeld was born in Łódź, but into Warsaw Jewish family. He then converted in 1918. Both wanted to leave the periphery of the empires to look for a more adequate education than they could find in the partitioned lands. Both chose German-speaking countries at the beginning of the 20th century, namely Prussia, later also Switzerland, where they both found mentors who helped them greatly to pursue their careers, and they advanced rather fast. Both after the First World War, during which both managed to further advance their scientific careers, chose to live in the newborn Polish state, and both stayed there also after Germany invaded the country in 1939. From then onwards, though, their almost parallel lives begin to drift apart. While Ludwik Hirszfeld was forced by the German occupiers to live in the Warsaw Ghetto, Jan Czochralski could remain in his home and go to his workplace. But again, even under those conditions, there's a commonality because both tried to continue their work. I will return to this later. After 1945, Hirszfeld, who fled the ghetto in 1942, was able to continue his work, while Czochralski, after the war, fell into oblivion, mainly because he was accused of cooperation with the Germans during the occupation, but the reasons for this are probably more complicated. So the double biography, and therefore a parallel and comparative analysis of these two lives, allows for a close look at different potentials of development of history in the 20th century, Central Europe, and thus for insights unavailable when focusing on just one individual. Parallel biography can show how similar or how different life stories can develop from a similar point of departure. And this perspective then also allows for the integration of new research questions, for instance, the transnational aspects of their lives. So I looked at the two scientists in combination with the perspectives of a transnational history of science, because this transnational examination of the lives of Ludwik Hirszfeld and Jan Czochralski enables to discuss then more general questions of the circulation and translation processes in which knowledge was and is generated. And the parallel biographical approach links the history of those protagonists also to the data they bore, and to the material or the substances they worked with, blood and metals, because processes of knowledge circulation or the transfer of material were closely connected to their transnational lives. So both acted in the frame of multiple geographies in which they introduced, developed, and transferred those practices of science and expertise they had acquired because of interaction and transnational communication. This way they became part of both German and Polish and also more global scientific cultures. And since those cultures themselves were already results of global processes of knowledge circulation, interaction and mobility, it is quite difficult to categorize those cultures or spaces of knowledge with clear attributions such as German, Polish, Jewish, Western, or Eastern. So in the book, I looked at the two lives also through the political and regime changes of 1918, 1939, and 1945. That means under the very different political conditions of the German Empire, the Weimar Republic, the Second Polish Republic, the National Socialist occupation, and state socialism. That means under the competing major political systems of the 20th century, democratic, authoritarian, and dictatorial regimes. And this enabled me also to trace the possibilities and risks of scholars living in those regimes, which includes the compromises they had to find and the limits they were confronted with. And also to look at the ways how they were able to grant their expertise the status of universal action guiding and highly sought after knowledge, which was in turn not always successful. And here the inclusion of the ruptures in their lives makes it also possible to show the limitations with which both were confronted and which temporarily placed them in differently justified positions of outsiders to society. So after this short introduction, I would like now to take a closer look at the lives of the two scientists. After leaving the peripheral parts of the imperial regimes they were born into, both migrated to centers. Czochralski began his education first in a pharmacy and then a small chemical company in Berlin, and he never there finished a formal education, so he counts mainly as an autodidact. However, due to his practical capital, Czochralski found employment in the large research laboratory of the General Electricity Company which is called AEG in Berlin, which he joined as a research assistant in August 1907. Okay, now I can't move this. Okay. Around the same time, in December 1907, Ludwik Hirszfeld, after finishing his studies in Würzburg and Berlin, began his first position after his doctorate at the German Cancer Research Center in Heidelberg, one of the leading cancer research institutes until today. Both young scientists now met mentors who, due to their innovative research ideas, styles of thinking, and the thought collectives to which they belonged, influenced them significantly. And both working places they entered were highly innovative at the time. For instance, the introduction at the AEG laboratory, the introduction of the relatively new metal aluminium in the electrical industry that was tried at the AEG, or also the experimental cancer research conducted in Heidelberg. And Hirszfeld and Czochralski both knew how to profit effectively from their integration into those research circles. So both began to create their own expertise and networks and established themselves with fundamental research on the substances they were dealing with. Hirszfeld, together with his mentor Emil von Dungern, demonstrated the heritability of human blood groups, and they introduced the classification of the blood types AB, AB, and 0. And with the publication of these findings, Hirszfeld established himself in the field of blood group research, which developed then very dynamically, especially in the 1920s. And he was convinced that his research had a greater meaning beyond strictly medical questions, and asked, I quote, "Will we not get into the creative rhythm of our era due to our research on the agglutination of blood?" End of quote. He was convinced that scientists like him could give a new direction to the course of events, or even to society, through their scientific work. He situated himself semantically in the frame of modernity, the time of an anticipated future in which he planned to intervene through research and expertise. Hirszfeld and von Dungern then, as the first scientists in the world, suggested a strong link between blood and race, a question that became quite popular in later years, especially in Germany, but also elsewhere, for example, in Poland and in Hungary. After the outbreak of the First World War, Ludwik Hirszfeld and his wife Hanna, also a scientist, decided to go to Serbia to offer their medical expertise in the fight against a typhus epidemic. Hirszfeld then became chief bacteriologist of the Serbian Army Medical Corps and was assigned to the largest hospital of contagious diseases located in Salonika. There, in September 1915, the Armée d'Orient, a multinational allied force under French leadership, had arrived, too late though, to help the Serbians to hold their country. Nonetheless, the allied troops remained there for the next 3 years. Soldiers and civilians from all parts of Europe, also from British and French colonies in Asia and Africa, were drawn together in this corner of the Balkans. In this setting, the Hirszfelds had the exceptional opportunity to realize a large-scale investigation of a possible relation between blood type and race. They conducted over 8,000 blood tests among 16 different ethnic groups. And like many European scientists from the field of medicine or physical anthropology, the Hirszfelds were quite enthusiastic about the advantages the conditions of war could provide for their research. Consequently, Ludwik Hirszfeld emphasized the major importance of, I quote, "comprehensive bacteriological material which can only be found in war," end of quote. Based on this wartime material, the Hirszfelds first showed that all blood groups could be found in all races. And then they related the blood groups to the geographical place of descent of the soldiers and postulated dominance of blood group A in the western parts of the world and a prevalence of B in the east. This they also visualized in this diagram that was printed together with their article on the findings in the high-ranking journal, The Lancet. Their results undermined the prevailing idea that human races could be clearly and scientifically separated from each other. Thus, they were highly innovative. In the years following the publication, their results spread fast around the world, and the new research field of zero anthropology was established. It became quite popular and dynamic, since heredity and racial belonging were hotly debated questions during the 1920s and 1930s, and blood groups counted as unconditioned by natural or social environment and were therefore seen as an objective marker of race. And the Hirszfelds, thereby, just like numerous scientists of the time, took it for granted that humanity was divided into races. This was just like common opinion, and there were not very many scientists who said the world is more complicated and we cannot use these classification into races. Also, Jan Czochralski contributed significantly to the advancement of his research field during this time before the First World War, when he dealt with the consistence of technically important metals such as copper, tin, brass, aluminium, and zinc, and worked on questions of crystallography. The results in the lab at the AEG proved to be very pioneering and contradicted the established doctrines of the time. Also, the so-called Czochralski method, for which Czochralski earned global fame, but only after his death, was developed in this laboratory accidentally in 1916, and it remains a popular method of crystal growing today, used to obtain single crystals of semiconductors. And the result of this crystal growing process, everybody of us finds in his or her smartphones. The outbreak of World War I determined Czochralski's further research in a similar way as Hirszfeld's. His company became the second largest armament factory in Germany following Krupp, and invested significant resources into the scientific problems of armament production. And this was mainly carried out at Czochralski's workplace. Due to the dire lack of raw materials during the war, his research concentrated mainly on ammunition from substitute materials, for example, producing cartridges from steel instead of the highly rare and extremely expensive copper, and those were then bought by the German army. His work was evaluated as being very successful, so already in 1917 he was appointed director of the metal laboratory of Metallgesellschaft, one of the largest trading companies for metals worldwide back then, with its headquarters in Frankfurt am Main. And there, at first, he was mainly obliged to do fundamental research on metal alloys without the expensive tin for the German railways, and on aluminium, which counted as the metal of the future. And in 1924, he managed to invent in teamwork, though, as almost every invention here I'm talking about were made in teamwork. So they invented an alloy for the German railways, which did not contain the expensive and important tin anymore and was based mainly on lead, the so-called Bahnmetall. And this was bought by many companies from around the world. So this alloy earned Czochralski not only a fair degree of national and international fame, but also some kind of a fortune, since he received an annual sum from the patent up to 1948. Czochralski, moreover, held several influential positions within the newly formed German Society for Metallurgy, which he had also co-founded in 1919 with some of the leading metallurgists and representatives of the armament industry in Germany, and in 1926 took over as head of the society. This way, he became part of a system in which scientists and engineers could gain enormous significance in Germany. He had a vision of mastering metals and accentuated his belief that the systematic use of technology and correspondingly the high estimation of engineers and scientists were essential for the development of society and even of mankind. So the new technical heyday, as he conceptualized his lifetime, constituted for him, I quote, the most important means for technical, economic, and cultural organization, the primary means of preserving humanity and the liberation of mankind, end of quote. Towards the end of the 1920s, Czochralski, as head of the Society for Metallurgy, who just had very successfully participated in organizing a huge exhibition of materials in Berlin, the so-called Werkstoffschau, where he was able to meet President Hindenburg also, and whose goal it was to show the world Germany's industrial strength again after the World War, after the lost World War. So at this time in 1928, he simply was at the height of his influence and his professional career in Germany, and he certainly had become a very well-known and well-respected expert for metallurgy. And especially his practical knowledge was very much appreciated. And exactly in this moment, he decided to leave. So his contract with Metallgesellschaft was cancelled. And we do not know if he did not want to work with them anymore or if they wanted to get rid of him. What we do know is that in his laboratory, less and less research was done, as you can see here, and much more contract work. So this development he must strongly disapprove. He was too much a scientist for this. And on the other side, the new Polish state offered him now to become a professor at the Polytechnic in Warsaw, a position he in Germany would not have been able to achieve due to his lack of formal education. So here we have to do with, coming from the field of migration research, different push and pull factors that made him leave Germany in 1928-29. And as it seems, those factors were as pragmatic as they might have also been patriotic. Again, there's a parallel to Ludwik Hirszfeld, who also decided to go to Poland after he did not get a promised job in Belgrade as head of a newly formed Institute for Sera and Vaccines, because some of his colleagues there feared that his expertise would be just too dominating over theirs. In Poland, both scientists were most welcome, since the country, just like other newborn states in the region, felt a strong need for scientific knowledge in the construction or reorganization of administration, the industry, and educational institutions. The new states had to prove their legitimacy and, even more importantly, their superiority over the former empires as a form of political, social, and cultural organization. So representatives of those states were eager to convince scientists who had left partitioned Poland to settle in the newly formed state. And those who came to Poland brought then considerable and very diverse knowledge into the new state, which made this area of science really like a transnational arena. Here now the question arises how the knowledge of those people was transferred, circulated, and generated through migration, and what kind of limitations there might have been to such kind of circulation. The transfer of knowledge always is like is seen here as a process that requires quite complex mechanisms of selection and adaptation. So circulating knowledge and local knowledge can merge and produce new knowledge, while existing knowledge can also be stabilized. So now I would like to look at two examples for such processes. First, Hirszfeld's workplace, the newly founded Institute of Hygiene in Warsaw, and then also look at Czochralski's work in Warsaw. So the State Institute of Hygiene, where Ludwik Hirszfeld started to work, was largely shaped by such a returning elite who brought organizational and technological models and styles of thought from different countries to Poland and combined them in the institute. Hirszfeld took over as a director of the Department of Bacteriology at the Institute of Serum Research. His institute was to correspond, albeit on a smaller scale, to the Institute of Experimental Therapy in Frankfurt in Germany, which Hirszfeld knew well. He went there himself to purchase the necessary equipment. It came also from elsewhere, but he also went there. And however, he never tried to translate the concept of the Institute in Frankfurt one-to-one to the one in Warsaw. Instead, adapting it to the necessities of the Polish situation, which meant, for example, for him, emphasizing questions of social hygiene much more than in Frankfurt. And overall, this institute then developed very successfully as an internationally recognized innovative body in the field of public health. A further example of successful knowledge circulation is Hirszfeld's continuous research on blood groups, which made Warsaw almost a global center for blood group research and zero anthropology. At an international congress of anthropology organized in conjunction with the meeting of the International Federation of Eugenics Organizations in 1927 in Amsterdam, Hirszfeld chaired the section on eugenics and heredity that dealt mainly with the introduction of blood group research into the field of anthropology. And when we look at those sections proceedings today, it really showed Ludwik Hirszfeld's high reputation within the international community of serologists who celebrated his findings at the Congress, as did also like newspaper articles that were written after the Congress was over. In other fields, however, Hirszfeld encountered greater difficulties in implementing his knowledge. For example, he was deeply convinced and also supported, for example, by Ludwig Fleck, that the practice of the bacteriological laboratory had to expand into every corner of the Polish state to be able to fight contagious infectious diseases. But in this field, there were so many obstacles to overcome that he could not succeed with his plan. He did not find enough doctors who were trained in bacteriology, and also an overall weak infrastructure prevented Hirszfeld's plans. So what we can see here from this example is that the emergence and the implementation of knowledge is very much tied to local conditions. If the local conditions do not correspond to the circulating knowledge, in this case bacteriology, and the necessity of the implementation of bacteriological practices, it did not have the chance to be fully implemented. This was a constellation also Jan Czochralski was confronted with. For him, a chair for metallurgy was created at the Warsaw Polytechnic. And next to his teaching obligations, Czochralski assumed control of a newly created Institute for Metallurgy and Metal Research, Institut Metallurgii i Metallosnawstwa, the IMM, this institute was financed by the Ministry of Military Affairs. Formally, this institute did not belong to the Polytechnic, although such an affiliation was suggested. The contract here foresaw that the IMM was supposed to take over all research on metals and metal alloys conducted for the military that hitherto had been carried out at military research laboratories. So this stood in accordance with the goal of a scholarly professionalization of the production in the armament industry under the direction of Czochralski, which meant at the same time heavily militarizing his research. Beyond that, Czochralski became head of the Military Technical Society and took over several other positions in different professional associations and institutions, and also acted as a counselor to politics and large industry in questions of armament and the military. He contributed this way significantly to the modernization of the Polish army, but it also seems that Czochralski took over so many tasks and positions in Warsaw that he was really kind of overloaded, and also with the many expectations that were directed towards him. Here we can see the number, for 1 year, the number of samples he carried out in his institute, and this is really like a heavy workload also. And then he also experienced some significant difficulties in implementing his expertise. His aim to sail the Polish railways, the metal alloy Bahnmetall, which was called Metal B in Polish. This alloy he had been so successful before with in Germany failed simply because he did not take into account the different local conditions in Poland, where the price for lead was much higher, and also some of the technological requirements for using the alloy were simply not given. Also, his work for the military turned out to be complicated or complex. While Czochralski, for example, wanted to research certain questions thoroughly and in long-term experiments, the military demanded rather quick results and complained about delays. Furthermore, Czochralski was supposed to work here in Poland with iron and ferrous alloys, research areas in which he did not have extensive expertise because he had clearly specialized before in non-ferrous metals. And here we can observe that the transfer of knowledge is not at all an easy task to fulfill, but rather a complicated cognitive and logistical undertaking in which questions of materiality, the agency of the materials, therefore somehow the agency of non-human actors, can play a decisive role. And an additional difficulty for Czochralski certainly arose when he got attacked because he still had German-Prussian citizenship, and that made him, especially during the heated political atmosphere of the 1930s, for some of his colleagues, he became somehow suspect. So here it becomes clear that expertise was not first and foremost a technical question, but also a political one. Czochralski's role of the universal and rather apolitical scientist or expert who could adapt to different environments and was highly welcomed in 1929 was no longer feasible in the late 1930s. Also, the fact that his laboratory at the Polytechnic was very well equipped, mainly with German instruments and machines, in this context eventually became not only a source of innovation, but also of conflict. During World War II, Czochralski's declining prestige within parts of the scientific community during the late 1930s then turned out to be rather disastrous. He was accused of collaborating with the German enemy since his lab at the Polytechnic, which the Germans allowed to be reopened shortly after the attack, amongst others produced items for the German Wehrmacht. Thereby, Czochralski was able to work and to provide others with a workplace, and this put him in a privileged position compared to many other inhabitants of Warsaw during the occupation. On the other hand, he helped the Polish underground and provided information about German industry. But this did not save him from being prosecuted. After 1945, a lawsuit was filed against him, and although he was ultimately not convicted of collaboration, he lost his chair at the Polytechnic and had to move back to his hometown, where he started to produce small pharmaceutical items. His behavior during the occupation was thus interpreted in categories of a clear-cut divide between good and bad, as it was imagined, especially from an ex-post perspective after the war. And here we do maybe need a more nuanced interpretation and look at the condition of occupation rather as a social practice, as a space of social relations that were full of ambiguities, that cannot always be resolved into a dichotomous opposition of resistance and cooperation or so-called collaboration. On the contrary, they reveal a broad these social relations reveal a broad spectrum of various forms of behavior, which allows for the existence of obedience and resistance at the same time. And to grasp those ambiguities, the concept of Eigensinn, introduced by historian Alf Lüdtke into everyday history, seems to be especially helpful, since this concept, which is quite hard to translate, means behavior that does not follow the either-or logic of domination or resistance, and takes into account that this question cannot always be answered so easily. As in the case of Czochralski's behavior during the occupation, that was coined by the willingness to compromise with the occupier on the one side, but also with the will to resist the Germans by helping the Polish underground. Ludwik Hirszfeld, by contrast, during the occupation, lost his position at the Institute of Hygiene immediately in 1939, when the German occupiers took over his workplace and replaced him and others with German physicians. And then he was forced to move into the Warsaw Ghetto in February 1941, although the German health administration in Warsaw had assured him in December 1940 that he, as a world-renowned serologist, would be allowed to stay in his house outside the ghetto walls as long as he did not practice as a physician. Hirszfeld himself was very much convinced that he would never end up in the ghetto because of his conversion, his reputation, and his contacts with German scientists. To him, the ghetto somehow constituted something like a denial of his whole identity construction. He felt a stranger there. Inside the ghetto, Hirszfeld nevertheless became one of the key actors in its medical care, also working together with the Jewish Council and therefore partly also with the occupier. The occupier, of course, forced the Jewish Council to work together with them, and as a teacher in the clandestine medical school. As many other doctors in the ghetto, he also had kind of a privileged status there, since their medical services were of utmost importance for life in the ghetto. They earned some money and they also had a sense of life. But as a convert to Christianity, Hirszfeld's position was not easy. The physician Chaim Einhorn remembered Hirszfeld's arrival in the ghetto as follows, I quote, "One day, Dr. Milejkowski brought Professor Hirszfeld to the hospital. First, we, the younger physicians, wanted to protest against Professor Hirszfeld, and we began a strike. We considered him a stranger. But later on, our relations normalized, and when it came to scientific research, our collaboration was excellent." End of quote. So parts of the hospital he worked in were organized for research, and a bacteriological research lab was created with Hirszfeld as its head, where he not only tried to continue his research, but also where some of his former assistants could find a workplace. Yes, here's some notes by Hirszfeld. He really, under those very, very difficult conditions, tried to continue his work. So Hirszfeld, as well as Czochralski, though under much more difficult conditions and in constant fear for his life, tried to translate patterns, habits, and daily routines from the pre-war world into everyday life in his new surroundings. And for example, his students in the medical school very much appreciated this. Many of them who felt bored or depressed or desperate within the ghetto walls, as a witness testified, I quote, "We had the choice of total desperation, total demoralization, suicide. Some did commit suicide, escapism, but instead we started to study." End of quote. Then in the summer of 1942, Hirszfeld managed to flee from the ghetto and spend some time in hiding until 1944. After the war, he was able to continue his work as a scientist and professor in Wrocław at the former German University of Breslau. And he also tried to maintain his international networks, which was aided by a visit from then Johannes Bauer of the Rockefeller Foundation to Wrocław in 1945, where he met the Hirszfelds and showed himself, quote, most favorably impressed with what he and his wife were doing in reorganization of the former German medical school, end of quote. This Johannes Bauer from the Rockefeller Foundation then recommended asking the Hirszfelds to come to the United States for a research grant, which they also did then for 3 months in 1946. Although Hirszfeld also tried in the following years to travel, to attend conferences and to meet with former colleagues, it became increasingly difficult as Stalinism began to spread across Poland from 1948 onwards, and this did not leave science and scientific life unaffected, of course. And from 1949 through 1945, a vigorous Lysenkoist campaign was waged in Poland, a campaign that was directed against genetics and Mendelian inheritance, and accentuated the heritability of acquired characteristics instead. And this not, of course, also affected Hirszfeld, since one of his major discoveries, the inheritance of the blood group system, now certainly did not conform to party ideology. Now it was for him to compromise, and on the one hand, he accommodated the regime to some extent and took part in some events to be able to pursue his research, and on the other, he remained strictly opposed to the interference of politics into his research. And this led to the fact that at the peak of Stalinism, he also faced quite severe obstructions to his plans, for example, to build up a new institute for immunology and so on. So to come to a short conclusion, Jan Czochralski and Ludwik Hirszfeld both were among the leading scientists of the 20th century in the technology of metals, as well as in serology and immunology. They initiated innovative research on their substances, on blood and metals in variable spaces of knowledge. They and the teams they worked with questioned established doctrines, anticipated future knowledge, stimulated discussions, and contributed to the development of their still young disciplines. They self-confidently situated themselves in modernity, the time of an anticipated future that they wanted to shape with their research and their position in society. And they considered their fields of knowledge, and somehow also thus themselves as well, to be decisive, even leading on this path, which was supposed to hold comprehensive improvements for humanity. According to their self-perception, they, like many other experts, advanced to become key resources for nation states, in this case for Germany and for Poland, for companies and for research institutions. They sought to implement their knowledge, which they had acquired in the German-speaking world and whose emergence was thus bound to time and space, in Poland after 1918. The transferred and already stabilized knowledge they brought with them merged with local knowledge in Poland. This was often a productive mixture, and the knowledge previously stabilized in international networks also changed in the new space. And with this mixture of knowledge and the ability to adjust, both individuals succeeded in the new order and were able to produce credibility for their knowledge and their institutions. Their status as experts was also due to the growth of international contacts and exchange, not only between Poland and Germany, but also in a wider European, if not transatlantic context. Nevertheless, the implementation of their knowledge in Poland turned out to be also a great challenge, not only because of the infrastructures, many of which had to be built first, and the great lack of capital also in Poland during the interwar period, but also because of political, cultural, and epistemological constellations that were new, different, and complex. This could result also in failure and disappointment, and what this again shows in both cases is the strong local conditionality of knowledge. Overall, the double biographical approach in this case allows for an understanding of how experts and their expertise, how knowledge was formed by performative actions and cultural ascriptions, and as a result of a close link between the scientific, technical, and epistemological, but also cultural, religious, political, and institutional factors in different national settings. In historiography, life stories like those of Hirszfeld and Czochralski, who both challenged the principle of territoriality since they and their expertise crossed borders and made them ever more permeable, were frequently overlooked, or were somehow for some time overlooked. In Germany, for example, both actors are still quite unknown. And although we shouldn't neglect the importance of the nation also for the daily lives of those transnational actors, it seems to be much more interesting to decenter their history and ask about aspects of mobility, of networks, of local knowledge production and its global circulation, in order to find out more about both the potential for innovation and the conflicts that the circulation of ideas and models can produce. And it then becomes clear that fragments of identity concepts, of loyalties and life stories are produced at various points in a lifetime and in different spaces, and that they do not always correspond to patterns one would expect. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll stop here.